Dances with Robots, a conversation with John Underkoffler, Part 2.
I flew to Los Angeles from Boston on Thanksgiving Day 2000 and, basically fell through the skylight into the middle of the Minority
Wait,
Report.
I'm, I'm
Yes,
imagining like a Chaplin-esque pratfall. Oh,
that's what it felt like. The next morning and was working on it. And, the kind of macro version of my job was to make sure that all of the technology that was portrayed in the film was a kind of harmonious knitted whole, so that again it didn't seem like, oh well, someone had contributed this idea for a gimmicky, whatever, and then we've got this piece of random technology. Like, it wanted and needed to feel of a piece, and that was an enormously fun and challenging task. And being embedded in the art department is the best possible place anyone can be. And I got to synthesize a bunch of stuff, some from scratch, some by pulling together threads that already existed. But of course, the biggest single chunk of work that I really dug in on was that gestural interface, because it had the potential, I should say, to be really kind of a pivotal thing for the film. And my goal was sort of twofold. One, in the back of my mind, I had this notion that, okay, the previous really great PK Dick film is of course Blade Runner. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with the source material, but then in some sense neither is Minority Report. And it has famously
yeah,
a UI, a voice-based UI
yeah.
that
Up,
soused
two,
Harrison
down, left.
Ford. Yeah,
Enhance.
exactly.
Yeah.
Uses, and it's total nonsense, right? Like, it looks and sounds unbelievably cool,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's great that you can operate it after drinking a fifth of scotch. But if you really nerd out and you get in there, you're like, okay, no, he's just
Yeah.
it's someone
No,
wrote some things for him to say, and I thought,
yeah.
okay, let's do better. We can make it. We can build a system, so we can design a system so that the really interested viewer can go back and say, oh, wait a minute, I see. That's thought all the way through, and that could work. And
Sure.
in the back of my mind was also the idea that, well, most of my life I'd built things like this. Maybe if it's good enough, it's something that we could just sort of pick up the thread afterwards and continue building. So there was that, and then the other kind of quiet goal I had for myself was to provide enough material for the actors and the director and the narrative, so that you wouldn't have to cut away from it, so that the scene could actually play out in something approximating real time, so that the actors were really operating a system, whether part of it was composited in later or not, it's sort of incidental. And that ideally, the some little tiny piece of the narrative could actually be exposited using, and that was tortured and awful. And I'm sorry, but like, rather than it being a kind of sparkly but 0-calorie moment, could a little piece of the story actually flow through those moments and that
Sure.
interface and that UI? So those were my partly subconscious goals.
We should. It's like a frothy cocoa, not a Pepsi One. Um,
Mm.
so delicious. So then to dig, I mean, again, forgive this. I mean, this is such the lean of my own research practice, but also so pivotal in terms of like Minority Report in relationship to this sort of the Circe verse that has. Did I
Mm.
tell you this? We screened Minority Report with live commentary and audience
No,
and served nachos. Yeah. So this is what we do at our conferences. We screen Minority Report and yell at the screen. Anyway,
that is
um,
great.
it's super fun. You should come, man. Um,
I'd love to make nachos
actually,
for people that are
actually, that
collecting.
oh, there's a fan base. Um, where did the gestures come from? Right. So like this is my ultimate like choreographic question.
Yeah.
Like, who told Tom Cruise to do what with what kind of like resonance and aura,
Yeah.
and like is this is all in the manual? This is like coaching. This is dramaturgical. Like how did that? Where did these gestures come from, and how were they rendered in these actors' bodies?
Yes to all of the above. I assembled my best shot at a coherent gestural vocabulary by sort of intensively studying all of the accessible extant human gestural systems, and that's ground air traffic control stuff. It's SWAT team and police stuff. It's musical stuff. It's sort of amusing to think that way back in his career, Spielberg had done a film that used the musical gesture system, right? There's a few cutaways in Close Encounters to the kind of resident musicologist doing that thing.
No.
So that's there's a little callback. But the big precedent. Well, I was about to say was, but I'm going to revise that verb and say would seem to have been sign language, right? American Sign Language,
Sure.
International Sign Language, because those are the systems that are rich enough to circumscribe all human meaning. And so I did pull a bunch of stuff from that, but ultimately, the heart of the gestural stuff is actually filmic itself. And so because a lot of what the characters are doing, the Tom Cruise character initially, and then Neil McDonough and Colin Farrell, and we can talk about that, is to direct the sort of reconstructed precog dreams through 3-space, to reconstruct a virtual camera, as it were, to
Sure.
fly through these crime
Fascinating.
scenes to collect clues.
Mhm.
And to do that, I found myself, just like I'm looking like an insane person standing in my little apartment, like trying out all this stuff in front of a mirror. But to do that, to task an imagined camera, you end up looking like a director talking with a cinematographer, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is a camera, right? And this is a camera that's looking at the floor,
Yeah.
and blah, 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 right? So it sort of unfolded. That was the spine of the gestural language, and then other elements from those other sources that I described became limbs and adjunct bits of it. But the spine really was thinking about how you would use your hands to describe movement through space and time.
Mhm, mhm.
So,
As a camera, though, I mean, that's totally fascinating. Or
well,
through a camera, or through an
yeah, through
apparatus,
a
maybe.
camera. So, like,
Yeah.
some of the time you are a camera. Like, this means have the camera look at the roof. This means have the camera look at the side wall. Have the camera move along. This one was I was
Yeah.
delighted
Yeah.
to discover that if you hold your hands like a XYZ coordinate system,
XYZ. Yeah.
you can. So there's XYZ, right? So you're dollying left, right, trucking forward and back, and craning up and down, to use
Yeah.
the terms of art. But you've also got pitch, roll, and yaw. So you
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
6 degrees of freedom in one hand. And that was so exciting. And that would come back to haunt us all later. So that was a different way of moving the camera. But there were also gestures that were about affecting the stuff on the screen, which was no
Right.
less important. So there was a distinction between one finger point and two finger point. And there was kind of a, like mime cowboy thing where this was kind of point and grab, right? Instead of point and shoot, but point and grab. And there was actually really excitingly, just for me and no one else in the world probably, like a
And
distinction between
our audiences. So
and
yeah.
particularly the audience, yeah. Like there was the idea of pointing two elements on the screen, and then there was the idea of pointing through them to the diegetic material that they contained. So one finger point
Yeah.
meant two finger point meant grab a chunk of stuff or a window, as it were, though we didn't thank goodness have actual windows, but grab a
Yeah.
chunk of stuff on the screen, a chunk of pixels, and move them around or do something with them. One finger point meant move, reach through that and do something with the diegetic content in the scene.
Yeah. Well, it's like a thing in itself, thing of itself. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yes.
um, yeah. Eat it, Blade Runner.
Yeah. I know Ridley is an avid listener, so we'll get the angry phone call soon enough.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll gladly pick up. So then the process of I would love to talk about the manual and
Yeah.
like again like maybe literally practically, and again if you can excuse the kind of the granularity of these questions, like how is it can you go talk us through like how we go from a manual to a choreographed gestural sequence that an actor has to embody
Right.
to that actor being told to do these specific things in this particular order with these kinds of inflections to the shot. Like, can you walk us through that like
Yeah.
rehearsal process?
Right. So after I'd put together the gestural vocabulary, which honestly was kind of 90% still in my head at that time, but you know how these things work. Like you work through it and you think about it and it kind of coheres, and then you've got a song or a poem, or you've got this kind of self-consistent thing in your head. And the next step very naturally was to write it down. So I wrote it down. I illustrated it with just like early digital photographs of myself again in a mirror, like doing the stuff, or actually frame grabs from video of the sequences getting enacted. And so that was a little training manual, a dictionary or thesaurus or something, which I distributed broadly. And that was in a way a bit of a tactical gaffe, only in the sense that no one has time to sit and read. It was still half academic the way I was writing about it.
Yeah.
It's slightly embarrassing to go back to it and look at it now.
Can we see it? Can you send it to us? Is this something that we can look
Yeah,
at?
I think yes. Let me find it.
Okay, that would be amazing.
So I distributed that around, and in hindsight, I know full well at this point that didn't convince anybody of anything. And it dawned on me then that it was lunacy for me to try to have tried to describe this really important for the film system that was intensely about movement, again through space and time, in a static medium like text and images. And so I realized I had to make a training video.
Yeah.
And so I stupidly, without telling anyone, I just disappeared from the production, from the art department, went and with the help of a great friend who figures in other parts of my life story, who's a very early digital VFX stalwart, just recorded myself against a green screen in his backyard, going through a bunch of actual sequences. Like, okay, this is a sequence that you would need to enact to, skim the camera along the surface of a table and catch this one moment, or catch an object in an unexpected position. It's kind of all Agatha Christie at that point. And then it was, it's 2001, so computers are just fast enough, and software is just good enough that one person working alone with way too much caffeine can create a simple computer graphics environment that would be the content of the screen. And so
Cool.
I'd recorded the human sequences first, and then I kind of backed the CG screen contents, as it were, into that, synchronized it all up, and then composited it. And the result is sort of amateurish, I hope in a charming way, maybe in an awful way, it doesn't matter. But it took me about 2 weeks to do that. I found out after I got back that everyone thought that I had quit and flown back to Boston or something, because I didn't tell anyone I was going to do this.
Sure.
But then I showed Alex what it was, and there was, I think, visible some combination of relief and excitement,
Cool.
evident on his face. And he said, "Okay, we have to get this to Stephen." And so I think it was probably later that day, completely unslept and disheveled, but clutching the little tape under my arm, we go to set. We were shooting the Hall of Containment scene. I remember vividly. So it was like really, really complicated camera moves in this huge set that would be digitally extended. And Stephen is there with a crew of 100, and the script supervisor, a fantastic woman named Ana Maria Quintana, whose filmography is worth checking out, but she was sort of a longtime Spielberg participant at that point, had a little bit taken me under her arm, because I was this sort of unruly, sort of uncouth, don't know what's going on kid. And she said, "Okay, just wait with me. I'll tell you when it's a good time to approach Stephen, because he's dealing with a billion things."
Sure.
But there was a moment when there was a lighting change, and she knew that he would have 5 minutes. And so she sort of trotted me over there, and I said, as you know, sir, I've been working on this stuff. I wanted to show you what I think those sequences could look like. And we rolled it. I think the thing was 3 or 4 minutes. And he said, let me see that again. We watched it a second time. And he looked up and he said, this is great. We can use this. And that was it. So, okay, that was the sort of, that was the stamp of approval.
Sure.
And then, and then manufacturing began, like that scene in Hudsucker Proxy, basically. And so that meant, very specifically to your question, it meant, understanding a little bit about what kind of information was in the script already, and how as the script was evolving, like, what are we going to find out in those scenes? Which critical bits of where the crime is going to take place and what time of day, and neighborhoods and architectural details and stuff like that. Then what does that mean in terms of this gestural language? And then it was training time. And I spent a bunch of time with Mr. Cruz, some of it in his trailer, and, some of it on set, just going through and making sure that he actually understood and could perform the language generally, not just the sequences that we knew we'd have to film, but the language generally. And that was, tremendously rewarding. And he's a really, really intense and serious practitioner, which
artist.
An artist. He was all about learning it. And so when it came time to shoot, this is some weeks or maybe a couple of months later, there we were on the set, and we knew, like, okay, in this little mini sequence, we're gonna, I don't know, we need the virtual camera to kind of dolly back out the window, tilt up, and then we're going to find an obscure architectural detail that
the crown molding or whatever. Yeah,
exactly, that pinpoints the neighborhood location. I think that isn't a precise example that showed up in the film, but I think we shot some of the stuff like that. And so I'd huddle with Tom, and he'd say, and it'd be like, okay, remember that it's like this to get back out the window, and then it's 2-finger, not 1-finger pointer. You're going to move this around, and just then the records from the DMV come in. You got to match the image of the guy from the precog dreams with the driver's licenses, and that's this and this and this. And he'd go, okay, I got it. And I would dive out of the way, the cameras would roll, and he'd go through it.
Fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of the aura of Minority Report and its aftermath, right? So it was this critically acclaimed film that obviously had reverberations across the film industry, but also academic circles, choreographic circles, military circles, state circles. Like, this is a film that like interlaces a bunch of different Venn diagrams. And I'm super curious then, like, sort of what your kind of next actions were after the film. Like, so you have this this aura, this filmic aura, this choreographic, this interface work is tapping into so many folks' imaginaries. Can you talk us about like what happens next? Like, where do you go next with this?
That film led somewhat inevitably to a brief slew of other film engagements, which are mostly not related. The next big one I did was the Hulk, Ang Lee's Hulk, I hasten to point out, which was marvelous and rapturous in a bunch of ways, not least because I met my wife on that film. And working with Ang is fantastic. I did Aeon Flux,
an experimental sci-fi animated series.
Incomparable Karin Kusama, and there's a little bit to talk about there, actually, directly relating to choreography. So the thumbtack in that, and a few others.
I'm deep on. I watched Aeon Flux on MTV in the 90s or whatever, and the film was
animations.
Amazing.
Brilliant.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you though.
And then the only other little filmic relevance to our current thread is that I did the first Iron Man, and so that some of that kind of gestural stuff came back, and in this case, it was working very much with the actor as a kind of creative force, so that was cool. And then a secret engagement with the third one. But the real vector is that after the film came out, I did start getting feelers, phone calls, emails from people in corporate contexts, basically trying to understand what they'd seen. Was it real? If it was real, was it available commercially or non-commercially? how could they get involved? How could they use it? If it's not real, could it be built? And so after after a few of those, it finally got through my thick skull that there was indeed an opportunity here, and I formed what would become Oblong
Oblong,
Industries,
John's
though I
human
wouldn't call
computer
that
interface
at
company.
the outset, to kind of pull this set of ideas that had been born in academia and existed as functioning code and real demo systems, and then been kind of purified through the the high intensity plasma arc of Hollywood and had all the flesh burned away from it, leaving the pure gleaming
Sure.
essence.
Dilithium crystal. Yeah,
Yes.
sure.
Can we pull that back into reality, but actually implement it in such a way that it's broadly available and maybe solves real world problems?
Sure.
And so began a series of commercial engagements and a really serious effort to build these systems, software and hardware, to do what people had seen in Minority Report, and actually to do a lot more that was some of which was maybe implied in the film, and a lot more that wasn't.
Yeah. Um, so I want to go in chronological order, but I'm not actually sure the chronology. So we talked briefly about
Raytheon,
Raytheon.
a
We talked a
prominent
little bit
aerospace
about
and defense
Oblong.
company.
Which came first? And like, how did I'm curious, like, what the order of those engagements were and how they shaped your thinking in terms of, for example, like, and we're going to get to this in a moment, but like, what do you say you won't do, or who you won't work for versus like what you will do and who you will work for? Like, I'm curious, like, how you in this, again, maybe post Minority Report moment, like, start making distinctions for yourself about the kinds of work that you're willing to do versus not.
Yeah, that's a hard one, and juicy and meaty and all those things, and we can probably talk for a long time about it.
Yep.
Uh, as you suggest, the first actual customer for G Speak was Raytheon, and it's a it was a a highly speculative kind of engagement for an entity like Raytheon, but there was a really sort of visionary young engineer manager there who was excited about it and managed to, engage some of the surrounding political machinery, and in order to get them to try this thing out. And to your point about what you will and won't do, the initial engagement was very, very broad. Like, can we build a system for that notionally, I guess, has something like a forensic investigatory whiff to it, like as shown in the film. Can we build that for real? Maybe in the context of having a whole bunch of cameras looking at some region and being able to kind of jump among them and correlate activity that's happening on one with stuff you see on another. So that was the very general context, and it was really about building out the core of the thing. And I'd been tinkering with the code, the MIT code, and had gone through a bunch of iterations, and I had engaged in other kind of non-commercial projects with it. So, but this was an opportunity to see how it would play and how it would fly in a context with a certain kind of stakeholder, and a pretty serious stakeholder which nonetheless understood this distinction between products that are ready to go and technology that's super promising and is going to take a while, very much to their credit.
Sure. Um, so then to talk a little bit about Oblong, and I've always wondered this, the name Oblong Industries, where did that come from?
Uh, well, I've always felt that, I mean, it's clear that good names are hard, and I'm not saying it's a good name, but like, it's worth naming things well. And
Yeah,
I'm a language guy, so that it took me about a month.
yeah,
It just and at the time, of course, all these startups had really hard, techie sounding names with
yeah,
harsh consonants and K's and X's and things like that.
sure.
I wanted something that suggested maybe the opposite, that suggested a kind of organic feel, a geometric feel, suggested and implicit in the name is a little bit of geometry,
Yeah.
and it's also typographically really fun, right? There's round shapes and ascenders and descenders, and
Mhm.
so it took a surprising amount of effort, but and it it delighted and upset and confused so many customers and people along the way that I felt pretty good about it. Like some people would get angry, like, but what? Why oblong? What does it mean? Like, well, what does tectronics mean, right? But
Sure.
so that's it. Just fun. It's a fun word.
Yeah. It is a fun word. It's delightful to say. It falls out of one's mouth. Can you talk a little bit about like how either through the Raytheon process or through the oblong process, like you work to develop a kind of commercial framework
Yeah.
for these technologies that were at once real but also speculative, but like they never stop being speculative even as they're real. Like I'm curious, like not only like how you conduct work in that environment, right? But like also, again, going back to my question from a minute ago, like how you decide who the work can be for.
Right. Uh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first part of the question, we were just so fortunate to have the movie as a reference point. I don't think we would have really survived without that because it was kind of shorthand that condensed an hour or 90 minutes of deeply unsatisfactory verbal description into 10 seconds. Oh, have you seen Minority Report? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. This is
like
literally,
that thing. Yeah,
oh, okay. Right. And because
done. Yeah.
it's a hard thing. People are excited about the future. It turns out when you actually present them with the opportunity to touch it and use it, a lot of people back off. A lot of people don't actually want it as it happens.
Mm.
Uh, but again, I don't know. No one likes to credit luck and fortune in our culture of rugged individualism, but we were just so incredibly fortunate to have had the minority, the film, the experience participating in the creation of the film, and then the film as a kind of compact object of reference. And honestly, easily half of our business came initially from the film, so I feel really, really lucky about that. And we, over the years, I'm proud that we served almost every discipline, almost every kind of commercial entity that you can imagine, from architecture to just sort of basic IT companies like IBM, Boeing and Raytheon, and the kind of aerospace and also defense sectors. Real estate is just on, engineering, on and on and on, just almost everything you can think of. And that for me was a core part of the way that we ultimately had to think about what we would and wouldn't do and who we would and would not serve. And
Yeah.
I had intended from the very beginning that G Speak and all these ideas of embodied kind of humanist, spatial, maybe gestural computation were fully general purpose. This wasn't just for architects, or it wasn't just for people looking at security cameras. It was intended as a full-bodied replacement for or
Right.
a successor to general purpose computing. And that means, on the one hand, I mean, it's very easy to turn this into a total cop-out. Well, everyone's going to use it anyway, so why bother to turn down business? But that's not, why bother to turn down any kind of business, no matter how ethically shady. We ultimately came up with a simple rubric, which is that we wouldn't refuse to work, let's say, with defense contractors. We did both defense and non-defense type work, for example, with Boeing and others, or defense-oriented and non-defense oriented stuff.
Sure.
But we would always decline to directly participate in weapons systems, like targeting systems, actually systems that are perfect fits for the kinds of kind of intensely spatially oriented stuff that we were building. So
Mhm.
uh,
That was the line.
that was
Um,
and is that acceptable? Is it ethically watertight? Almost assuredly not. Could we do better? Probably, but it felt really important to have a line, and one that was easy to articulate in a sentence to customers, but actually even more importantly to colleagues, to folks that you were working with, because that was
yeah.
really important to a lot of the people that worked at Oblong over the years.
I'm sure. Well, no, I mean, for me, that totally makes sense. Like, given that you're talking about an interface modality that's intentionally not dual use, but like omnivorously useful, and you can't
Like,
like constrain embodied metaphor. It's like not something that you can like wrap your arms around or like hold on to.
yeah,
All you can maybe control, I think, what I'm hearing from you is like what you are willing to yourself work on.
that's right. Just so, yeah.
Okay. Um, so what are you working on next? Like, what are you excited by? I know we talked a little bit about like Black
Black
Mountain
Mountain, an
as a kind of
interdisciplinary
like
museum and art
font
center.
of
Yeah.
a kind of a historical moment that's exciting to you, that has like kind of collaborative or institutional modalities that are exciting or like relevant to you
Yeah.
today. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like what's next, but also like how do you like approach what's next from your very rich citational practice?
Hmm. Well, there's a kind of layered stack of what's next. And after I disengaged from Oblong about 3 years ago, I went through a, a drearily predictable process of introspection and review. And in thinking about what's next, you think, well, what what would I like the texture and feel of my day-to-day work to be? And the obvious thing, especially in our kind of, I don't know, startup saturated world, is to do the next startup. But I was never a kind of entrepreneur for entrepreneurship's sake guy. And I sort of quickly decided that I wasn't going to do another company because ultimately, for the kinds of for the kinds of topics and ideas that I was interested in pursuing, the structure of a commercial entity, it turns out to be inappropriate. And that got me thinking quite a bit about human organizational structures in general, because I was just sort of flipping through the imagined catalog of such entities, and I haven't been able to find one that feels like a place, a sort of surround, a set of people, a set of connections that I want to spend the next 10 years in. So just to sort of preview a half paragraph forward, I'm very much engaged in trying to figure out if can we invent a new structure that would be a blast and something worth putting energy into creating, something that doesn't already exist. But I'm, just in a day-to-day sense, one of the liabilities, again, of a commercial structure is that G-Speak itself is not accessible to me, right? So that's a set of systems and software and frameworks and whatever else that is owned by Oblong. And so I have rewritten and written better, I think, a core set of those ideas now called Zeugma, and written in four languages instead of just one. So
Okay.
just to sort of feel, how does it feel when expressed in different forms? So part of the goal there is to open source that stuff and kind of let it go out in the world in a non-commercial sense that'll probably have some commercial implications, but more importantly, you know, let's see what happens when there's no impediment to anyone's use of it, and it may be a kind of dull, thud of a chunk of meat falling on the concrete slab, or maybe bits of it get picked up, and that itself will be an interesting experiment. But I've used it, and my colleagues have used it to build a couple of museum exhibitions. So it's already seeing some use. So there's that. I'm getting really serious these days about building a new operating system because the the Media Lab work starting in the mid 90s really was on my part, a naive response to my assumption that fundamental UIs and fundamental operating systems probably ought to change, or kind of have their crank turned fully once every decade. Let's say that's
Sure.
as good an interval as any. Uh, because in '94 it had been 10 years since the Macintosh took us from the command line to a kind of wonky pseudo pictorial iconographic representation of our world. And in '94, I thought, okay, time for the next one. And as it turned out, we got stuck in the old one because also instead, what happened in 94 is we got the web. And you look at the literature, there was to a woman, to a man, like everybody in the CS world kind of turned 90 degrees to the left to chase this new internet and web thing, leaving behind the opportunity to make something more primal, more fundamental, and bring that forward. And then 10 years after that, we got the kind of mobile computation thing, the smartphone and tablet deal. And so we're now in a weird state of being locked into a set of UI paradigms and the operating systems that underlie them and that serve them and that enable them, that were meant for a different era, that were meant for a time when there weren't that many pixels, they weren't in color, there weren't networks, that a little tiny awful zero-dimensional fly speck creeping across your screen attached to the chunk of plastic that is a mouse that, you know, summarizes the delicious dexterity of your five-fingered human hand as if it were a stump, you know, like had no fingers and could only move around on a two-dimensional plane, when that was adequate. And that's what we've got now. That's the
Well, it sounds silly when you put it like that. I mean,
someone's got to, you know, smack this thing in the back of the head. Like it didn't descend from Mount Olympus fully formed and, you know, and intended for forever.
Sure.
But we're at a moment when it seems like that. And even generationally, presumably generationally, there are people now who haven't used a mouse, but who've probably still used a trackpad or a mouse pad on a machine. But that UI paradigm, we're locked into in a way that I think is cognitively perilous, right?
Sure.
So let's at least see and try something new. That was my intent in 94. It didn't happen then. It didn't happen 10 years after that. But I don't see any reason that it couldn't happen now. And so a few shadowy colleagues and I are getting really serious about starting to build an operating system that is about space and time, that is about collaboration. It's about multiplicity, right? Like these awful UIs that we have are single person only, right? They're incredibly solipsistic, and architecture is a very useful metaphor to reach for. And it's the equivalent of, you know, of single occupancy architecture. Like, oh, here's a Louvre. I've delivered your Louvre. Hope you enjoy it. Oh, by the way,
for you. I'll live
yes,
for you.
one person can go in at a time. Like, what is, you know, right? So the idea that more than one person might want to look at and interact with stuff at the same time, and moreover that the digital medium should assume that its job is to assist in human collaboration and in the extension of, you know, the transduction of human will and intent into forms there, but also all around us architecturally. So that's one thing going on. This nascent.
So that's a thing. That's the thing you're working on.
And
well, so maybe this is a good segue.
Yeah.
Actually. So I'm thinking as Ariane materializes, maybe I know. Maybe we take. I'll maybe stop recording in a moment. We take like a 90-second tea break or bio break, and then maybe we hop onto the Zoom link and you can show us around some stuff.
Great.
Want to see these concepts and ideas in action? Watch part 3.
Brown University's Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies Conference for Research on Choreographic Interfaces, thanks to Marshall Woods Lectureships Foundation of Fine Arts, the Brown Arts Initiative, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their generous support of this project.
DWR, an interview with John Underkoffler. Thank you to John Underkoffler for spending time nerding out with us. For more info, visit https://www.linkedin.com/in/John-Underkoffler/. The CRC team: Sydney Skybetter, CRC founder; Ariane, Michaud, executive producer; Kate Gao, archivist and producer; Dances with Robots team: Laurel Lawson, accessibility consultant; Megan Hall, podcasting consultant; Kamal Sankram, music commission; Jim Moses, sound editor; Rishika Kartik, student associate. Thank you to TAPS at Brown University: Chris Reddyhan, academic department manager; Alex Ripton, academic events and facilities manager; Brianne Shaw, communications and audience services manager. Thank you to the Brown Arts Initiative at Brown University: Kira Del Sesto, Sophia Lacava Bohannon, Peter Chanot, Chuan Ju, Nix Bennett, and a huge thank you to Rebecca Rex in the Office of Corporate and Foundation Relations.
Thank you to the OnTap podcast for supporting early ideas around this project, and Panel Camp for sending over valuable resources. More info at ontappod.com. More on Circe at https://choreographicinterfaces.org/. Listen to our podcast, Dances with Robots, www.danceswithrobots.org.